Bienvenue à tous. Welcome to Reporters Plus here on France 24. I'm Mark Owen. In this edition, Rwanda. On the 25th anniversary of the genocide, we have an exclusive report on the role played by France in one of the darkest periods of history. At least 800,000 people were slaughtered in the Rwanda genocide, a chain of atrocities that began when the aircraft carrying the then President Juvenal Habyarimana was shot down. He led a Hutu government. The Tutsi people were blamed for his death, and this was the catalyst that pushed Rwanda towards genocide. The question of the role of France has been raised many times. Did the French military operation to end the violence, Operation Turquoise, merely act as a screen to allow France's Hutu allies to escape justice? Paul Kagame, a Tutsi president of Rwanda since 1994, has only just mended relations with the Elysee. Questions, though, still remain unanswered. Our special report by Michael Stanka.
Nitwa Nyirimboga Emmanuel. Imodoka ye ipakira ibikoresho twakoraga ahantu Kinyamakara, muri komine Kinyamakara ahantu bubakaga amashuri Imbogo. Ngeze mu nzira ndiho nsubira mu kazi yari mu gitondo ku itariki 6 kuko twubakaga Kinyamakara. Arambwira ngo uyu munsi nta kazi gahari, Habyarimana yapfuye, tugiye gutangira urugamba. Abatutsi ni 9. Ubwo bariyeri twashyizeho bahise baduha amabwiriza yuko umututsi uzagiye uhahita kuko amarangamuntu yari mu bwoko. Hari abaguye kuri bariyeri, hari abaguye hano mu giturage, hari n'abaguye hano ku rwibutso i Murambi. Reka nze nkwereke uko tubishushanyiriza. Urabona iki cyabaga ari nk'igiti kinini, tukagiconga kandi tukagiconga gutya tukakibaza. Twamara kukibaza cya kindi kigasigara kimeze gitya. Kigasigara kimeze gitya tukafata gutya nyine nakakubita.
10,000 deaths a day. After 2 months of massacres and under a UN mandate, the French army intervened.
Noneho tumaze kwica abatutsi baje kutubwira ko tujya kwakira Abafaransa baza mu gihugu. Twahuriye hariya hejuru ku karere hari kuri prefecture. Turi abantu benshi tugenda turirimba.
This former Hutu fighter was sentenced by a people's tribunal to 7 years imprisonment for the crime of genocide. Why, for 25 years, has France been associated with the Rwanda tragedy? What part did it play? France's closely guarded secrets are only now being revealed. In Rwanda, hatred between the Hutus and the Tutsis dates back to the colonial era. At the time, colonial power Belgium granted the Tutsis positions of responsibility. In 1962, once Rwanda had become independent, the Hutu majority took power. Tutsis were hunted, expelled, and massacred. Many fled to neighboring countries. Exiled in English-speaking Uganda, they created a rebel movement, the Rwandan Patriotic Front. Fearing losing influence to Anglo-Saxon powers, France chose to side with the French-speaking Hutus to bring them under French influence. During his time in office, President François Mitterrand unconditionally supported the Hutu dictator Juvenal Habyarimana.
Défendre le pouvoir du président Habyarimana au Rwanda.
Defending President Habyarimana's power in Rwanda represented a way to oppose a kind of Anglophone control of the Great Lakes region. And this geocultural motivation played a very important part. The Belgian colonizer not being there anymore, Rwanda became the key to enter Zaire. Zaire was a huge and extraordinarily rich territory. And it's not impossible that French policies aimed at securing this entrance to a territory indirectly controlled by France represented a considerable geopolitical advantage.
From 1990 onwards, cooperation between Rwanda and France intensified.
Troops were sent to this country, which is as large as a French province. There were up to 1,000 soldiers present at the same time. Between 400 and 1,000 soldiers for months and months who went on to shape and train the army. Supplies were delivered, a whole program of military assistance, to the point that some French officers took charge of the operational command of the Rwandan army. There was an extremely strong cooperation.
Between 1990 and 1993, the aim of that military assistance was to salvage Habyarimana's regime against RPF attacks. During that same period, the ruling party organized sporadic massacres of Tutsi communities.
What seemed to be pogroms were perpetrated regularly in Rwanda against the Tutsi communities. A program, obviously, with the complicity of the state, the militias, and the governors. In a country as tightly controlled as Rwanda, such a program could not take place without the local and national authorities turning a blind eye.
In 1991, a high-ranking officer alerted Paris about a possible genocide. General Jean Varret was at the time the head of the French military mission of cooperation in Rwanda. Speaking out for the first time on camera, this four-star general has decided to explain.
I was asked to chair a reunion of gendarmes who wanted help from the military cooperation. During this meeting, the chief of police told me, well, I need machine guns, I need artillery. This request astonished me, and I told him, you're a policeman, it's okay for me to supply you with tear gas, etc., but not machine guns. So I said no. Then he told me, look, we're all military people here. I'm a colonel, you're a general, let's speak frankly. I need this equipment for my men because we're going to join the fight against the Tutsis. So I asked him what he meant. He said, well, you know, we're going to eliminate them. There aren't many of them. It'll be over quickly. I told him, do you realize what you're saying? He said, yes, but that's how it is in our country. The Tutsis are a danger. We're going to eliminate them.
General Varret told his superiors about his fears, but France went on supporting the Hutu regime, taking no notice of his warning.
There were meetings of colonels. I don't recall any particular generals taking part. And they were taking stands, telling me, we must help the Hutu army fight the Tutsis. Whether they meant the FPR or the whole Tutsi ethnic group, I don't know. But very often the Tutsis were assimilated with the FPR as being the enemy. And I just kept saying, beware, beware, beware.
And what did they answer?
Oh, they listened politely, but took no account, and then little by little, I got the impression that my theory wasn't being taken seriously. I really think that French policy at that time was to let the Hutus think that France would turn a blind eye should there be a massacre.
General Jean Varret was an embarrassment to French authorities. He ended up being pushed aside and eventually resigned. France pursued its military cooperation with Habyarimana's Hutu regime. In this note marked confidential defense and addressed to President François Mitterrand, French army headquarters confirm a delivery of arms to Rwanda.
Ammunition was provided in the first days of the crisis. A useful move would be to send now a small batch of rockets to equip the helicopters.
The genocidal machinery started to function from the end of the year 1990, continued until 1994, and I can say it was nurtured by France, by the French army, like a broody hen. And if France hadn't intervened to save the Rwandan army, then Habyarimana's regime, the Rwandan army, and the militia would have collapsed.
In 1993, with the weakening of Habyarimana's regime, France organized agreements for a fragile peace between the two sides, the Arusha Accords. Their official aim: preventing a civil war in Rwanda.
During all those years, French policy was to bind all parties instead of heading toward a civil war and general extermination, to reach a compromise. Looking back, it might seem naive, but regardless of what anyone might say, it cannot be said that France was an accomplice to what happened later, since France was the only country in the world to have tried to prevent it.
These agreements were deemed treason by Hutu extremists, numerous within Habyarimana's regime. They were never applied and were blown to pieces just a few months later. On the evening of the 6th of April 1994, Hutu President Habyarimana was assassinated in an attack on his plane. Rwanda was plunged into turmoil.
President Habyarimana was assassinated on the 6th of April in the evening. During a series of meetings, the French embassy set up an acting government for the 8th and 9th of April. Thus, France continued to support a government in which it didn't see or didn't want to see that it was the extremists who now have the upper hand. Hutu power extremists determined on a massacre.
This acting government was composed of Hutu extremists who ordered the population to kill Tutsis and Hutu moderates. For 100 days, from April to July 1994, Rwanda descended into unimaginable violence. Men, women, and children were slaughtered by a genocidal machine in full swing. Nearly 1 million people were methodically murdered. After 2 months of massacres, on the 22nd of June 1994, France was given a mandate by the UN to launch a peacekeeping mission. This was the beginning of Operation Turquoise and the deployment of 2,500 troops to Zaire and Rwanda. Paris presented this operation as a humanitarian mission to end the killings.
What did we see happening? We saw the best units in France arriving, elite units which were superlatively trained and equipped. We saw weapons which didn't exist officially at the time start appearing on the battlefield. These troops were ready for all kinds of battles, but not at all to deal with a humanitarian mission.
Why did we send such an important military operation with planes and armored trucks? Well, because before, in Somalia, America had some men killed due to lack of equipment to protect their soldiers during the Somalian operation. Well, here, as it happens, and considering the FPR is hostile and that the Rwandan armed forces are shaky and all those things, we don't want to be trapped by the hazards of a confrontation. So we set up means to avoid a confrontation, but it was a totally defensive aim.
The RPF rebels, led by Paul Kagame, kept progressing into the country. Under the guise of a humanitarian mission, France deployed its best elite units. During Operation Turquoise, junior officer Guillaume Ancel was given the mission to guide pilots for airstrikes. He remembers having been ordered to prepare an airstrike against the RPF.
The Legion company I was told to join was all excited because they were ordered to move to the other side of the Nyungwe forest, a tropical forest about 40 kilometers wide, to go and set up an ambush on the approaching RPF. We were informed that the RPF, which is in front of us, was about 1,500 men strong, and we knew they were very well trained and their command was top quality. They were real warriors, and we were only 150 men. The choppers take off, we start going up, and it's at this point that an operations officer comes out of the command post of Special Forces and orders the helicopters to land immediately. We were furious. We were on our way to fight. The operation was launched in the usual way. You don't stop an operation which is already underway. Then the operation officer informs us we were to set up a humanitarian zone. It was the first time we heard about humanitarian action in this operation. And the Legion guys, who have a very special kind of humor, told me, "Guillaume, you were in charge of airborne strikes, now you're in charge of humanitarian strikes."
The former military commander in charge of Operation Turquoise disagrees with Guillaume's version of events.
I am perfectly aware of all the major decisions which were taken by General Lafourcade or the Paris headquarters. I was at the heart of the system. At my level of responsibilities, I am one of the 3 main officers directly under the general in command of the operation. I have never known of such an order or counter-order.
There was never any question of such an action. At the onset of Operation Turquoise, and that is why I had myself ordered fighter planes, we didn't know how the various parties would react, particularly the attitude of the RPF towards French forces.
Nevertheless, a French pilot stationed on a base in Zaire delivered this troubling testimony. Now serving in the reserve, he prefers to remain anonymous. In a handwritten letter, the pilot stated that he waited on the same day as Guillaume Ancel for an order for an airstrike.
On June the 30th, 1994, in the evening, on the Kasangani base in Zaire, the crews received the order coming from Goma, where the headquarters of Operation Turquoise were based, to prepare fire support to help ground forces.
Fire support or an airstrike against the RPF. For the soldiers involved in Operation Turquoise, things were getting confusing. In Rwanda, the Hutu population and the Rwandan army welcomed the French enthusiastically. France's historical ally, the Rwandan armed forces, helped by militiamen and police, were leading the genocide. The militia member Emmanuel Nirimbuga remembered his relationship with the French soldiers of Operation Turquoise.
noneho nyuma yaho yuko bamaze kugera hano ahindutse zone turquoise ubwo baje hano mu kigo hano Murambi bamaze kuza hano mu kigo Murambi twajyagayo tugacukura imyobo iriya indaki abasirikare barwaniramo noneho bakaduhemba za biswi bakaduha nari amazi yo mu pipiri.
Did they know that you'd killed Tutsis?
Bari babizi kuko baza bahagera hari n'abatutsi bake bahasanze bari barokokeye ku kigeme.
At this point, did the French army realize that a genocide was taking place before their eyes?
There's a vision of violence in terms of massacres, in terms of, let's say, reciprocal massacres. And so we have the elements of a civil war, which would have to be stopped, pacified. One does not see that they are killers on one side and victims on the other.
A major event was about to change the minds of the soldiers of Operation Turquoise. On June the 27th, 1994, a French patrol and some journalists found hundreds of Tutsi survivors in the hills of Bisesero. Journalist Patrick de Saint-Exupéry was among them.
People were emerging from the sides of the road, and those people were in a really bad state, really pitiful. It was unbelievable. They told us every day we're being tracked, every day they come to kill us. And they took us to this hill and they lifted some earth and there were corpses, there were dead people. The hill was riddled with death. They were everywhere, everywhere, everywhere. The officer said, "We'll come back in 3 days." And we left because we didn't have the means or possibility of doing anything. There were no orders, so we left.
Following their chain of command, the French soldiers abandoned the Tutsi survivors to the Hutu militiamen. They came back only 3 days later, on the 30th of June.
I wasn't going to send 2 badly equipped jeeps to the hills when we could hear the FPR bombings a dozen kilometers away. I wasn't going to send them without a supporting force or any security. If I had gone hastily, I would have had an ambush and French casualties. I'm sorry to say, but between the death of 10 French soldiers and the deaths of some Hutus because of my lack of concern, well... Yes, I mean Tutsi, sorry.
During those 3 days, without the protection of the French army, 1,000 Tutsis were killed. When the soldiers of Operation Turquoise returned to the Bisesero Hills, they finally started to act, rescuing about 800 survivors. After these massacres, Operation Turquoise became strictly humanitarian. The French army then set up camps to receive the Tutsi refugees and take care of them. To shelter the victims of the confrontations between the Rwandan armed forces and the RPF, France set up a humanitarian zone in South Rwanda.
I was the one who proposed a safe humanitarian zone. We considered that there was a risk that the conflict between the RPF and Habyarimana's army would take place precisely in the zone where we were intervening to stop the massacres. But in that zone, the only thing we were allowed to do, according to the UN resolution, was to stop the massacres.
On July the 15th, 1994, the members of the Hutu genocidal government, as they fled from the RPF, also found refuge in this humanitarian zone.
Clearly some heavy black limousines arrived in the town, with a few trucks full of Rwandan military, most probably those belonging to the Presidential Guard. It was obvious those men were not welcome in the zone. Whatever their responsibility or not, we weren't there for the sake of the old commanders of a regime which had just collapsed.
In a diplomatic telegram sent to Paris that day, the French ambassador called for them to be arrested immediately.
We know that the authorities are hugely responsible for the genocide. We have no other choice but to arrest them, however difficult that may be.
So immediately we asked for orders. They're passing through now. What should we do? Well, as for me, right then I reported to General Lanxade. Legally, I had no right to arrest people against whom I had no mandate to act.
Here was France's reply to the request from the chief of Operation Turquoise. A Reuters dispatch asserted that Paris was ready to arrest the government members. The then Secretary of the Élysée, Hubert Védrine, wrote these few words.
President's reading. This is not what had been said at the Prime Minister's.
Therefore, the Élysée did not agree to arrest members of the genocidal government.
The United Nations mandate would never have been given if we had asked for a mandate to impose justice. The UN mandate was humanitarian, not judicial. It wasn't the weapon of a criminal court.
Dealing with people responsible for the genocide was not our problem. In other words, we didn't have the right to do it. There was a legal framework determined by the UN resolution, and we couldn't act outside of it, especially for the military. For them, there was a risk of having to appear before international courts.
Would France have been prosecuted for arresting members of the acting government at the time? I don't believe there would have been any problem, because everybody, in spite of everything, realised that the acting government initiated the massacres. And I can't imagine that there would have been any strong legal process. All the more so, given that UN members are all bound by the 1948 Convention on Genocide, which obliges every state to prevent and repress the crime of genocide. That means that France could have simply argued it was contributing to the prevention of risks to civilians and the punishment of a number of people responsible.
Acting on orders from Paris, the military members of Operation Turquoise protected and organized the escape of tens of thousands of refugees. Among them, members of the Rwandan army, Hutu militiamen, and members of the genocidal government. The French army didn't deny it, and the operation was even promoted in this Foreign Legion magazine, Képi Blanc.
The headquarters of Turquoise helped organize the evacuation of the acting Rwanda government to Zaire. On July 17th, the Rwanda government crossed into Zaire.
No, we didn't arrest them. We brought about and organized their escape. In reality, we provided shelter or gave them the means to find shelter.
Once they had crossed the border, some of them were flown by military aircraft to Central Africa, for example. And there they could leave, so they left. A certain number went to Togo or to Cameroon, and so we were able to find them. The deputy prefect of Gisagara himself admitted during an audience that he had left the Congo in a French plane, heading to Central Africa. He said so himself. I don't think he was the only one who benefited from this transport.
Some of the presumed culprits found shelter on French soil.
Anyway, there were local authorities here who had indisputable responsibilities and who weren't the least bit bothered. Even before complaints were lodged, they weren't disturbed by it.
The International Penal Court for Rwanda condemned 17 out of the 21 acting government ministers. At least 10 of them had passed through the turquoise zone, notably the Prime Minister Jean-Claude, who was arrested 3 years later and sentenced to life imprisonment. In France, legal investigations were conducted against several officials accused of genocide. Laurent Serubuga, former Deputy Chief of Staff attached to the Rwanda Armed Forces. Agathe Kanziga Habyarimana, wife of President Habyarimana. Laurent Buchi-Beruta, former Prefect of the Gikongoro Province. They are still living undisturbed in France today.
Our special report on the Rwanda genocide by Michael Stanker. You can see it again, of course, via our website, france24.com. This is Reporters Plus on France 24. Stay with us.